We are here on the Post Road in Scarsdale, which is where all of the early houses were built. However, this is the very earliest house from Scarsdale. I know that because I lived in this house for over 30 years. We moved here in 1967, and this is where I raised my 4 children. In 1698, an Englishman named Caleb Heathcote came to America with the intention of buying what would be the last manor given by a king of England. And he named his manor Scarsdale. That comes from the ancient Saxon word scars, meaning rocky, and dale, of course, as being a dale. He was able to purchase Ye Fox Meadow, which is what is now Scarsdale. He also purchased many acres in Mamaroneck, which is where he eventually built his own manor house, and actually he never lived in Scarsdale. Now suddenly he is the landlord of the only person who lives in Scarsdale, who's the unknown Dutchman. We don't know even how long the Dutchman stayed here. We have no idea. All we can tell you is that in 1729, a northern Irishman from County Tyrone named Thomas Haddon bought 130 acres across the road, which is now Wayside Cottage. It mentions in the bill of sale houses, so we are pretty sure that that means that the small house that was already there, as well as the Dutchman's house, were part of his property. The Dutchman built a small one-room house, but it had 2 stories. We have no idea when Benjamin Underhill actually bought this house and came here with his wife, and where they had 11 children. We assume it was sometime either during the Revolution or just following the Revolution. He built a second house, which we always call the Underhill house, and that is the one that is closest to the road. At some point, they needed a third house. It was right here over what is the well. It was a spring house. They probably did it in the fall when the ground was beginning to freeze. They just rolled it on logs or sledges and dumped that house on dirt. The other 2 houses do have cellars. A Dutch door is one that opens from the top and keeps the farm animals here, but lets all the nice fresh air into the house. Wayside Cottage is one of Scarsdale's best-known pre-revolutionary houses. The cottage is across the road from the Underhill house, and both were owned by Thomas Haddon, who lived in the cottage from 1729 until his death in 1761. We know very little about this farmer who came here from Northern Ireland. We do know that he left his wife and 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, Deborah, who was later, many years later, to marry one of the Tompkins boys from up the Post Road. His will is very revealing because it shows us that he had a second family of 7 children with an enslaved woman he refers to as my wench Rose. Here are some excerpts from his will. I give to Mary Werns and to the wench Rose the use and profit of my house and lot of land lying at the north end of my farm. I give to my Negro children, Francis, Robert, Amos, Lazarus, Dennis, Jacob, and Eleanor, the sum of 25 pounds to them in good and lawful money. It is my will and desire that all of my Negroes be exempted from slavery, and I give them all free from anyone claiming them as servants. And I order my executors to bind my Negro children out to trades as soon as they are fit, and also take care that they are learnt to read. After the death of Thomas Haddon, the Varian family lived in the cottage from 1764 to 1853. The Varian brothers were butchers and patriots during the War of Independence. For several generations, the family ran a popular tavern. It was a favorite stop for weary travelers and drovers driving their cattle to market in New York City along the old post road. The Varians sold their land to Charles Butler in 1853. He was a wealthy attorney and part of a new group of businessmen who had started building their country mansions in Scarsdale after the railroad made commuting possible. When Butler died, his daughter Emily Butler inherited the 500-acre estate and wayside cottage. During World War I, she volunteered her land for the community farms. Most of the participants were women, and one of the organizers was Laura Crane Burgess. Her husband owned the pre-revolutionary Burgess House directly across the street from Scarsdale High School on Burgess Road. She was the daughter of Alexander Crane, who owned the stone mansion that became the Lutheran Trinity Church on Crane Road. Emily Butler supported the suffragettes movement, and they held meetings at the Wayside Cottage to campaign for women's voting rights. Women finally got the vote in Westchester in 1917, but they would have to wait 3 more years to vote nationally. Emily Butler deeded the Wayside Cottage to the Scarsdale Village, and it became the headquarters for the Scarsdale Women's Club. When they outgrew the cottage, they moved to their present home at Rowsley Mansion on Drake Road. It was built by William Bailey Lang in 1858, and he planned the house around the magnificent ancient oak tree which still grows today. The Wayside Cottage was also the home of the Scarsdale Enquirer. The League of Women Voters bought the failing paper for $1, and it was run by all women volunteers in its early days. From 1928 to 1951, books lined the walls of the cottage. This was the first home of the Scarsdale Library. Since 1953, the members of the Junior League of Central Westchester are the custodians of the Wayside Cottage. They have preserved its historic traditions, hosting events and guided tours for elementary school students. Another early house along the Post Road that was a museum for many years is the Cudner Hyatt House at 937 Post Road. It was built circa 1734 and was lived in over 2 centuries by only 2 families, the Cudners and the Hyatts. When Oliver Hyatt and his wife Elvira died in 1974, the Scarsdale Historical Society was formed to save the house from developers. They renovated the house and turned it into a house museum. Each room was meticulously decorated to reflect what life was like in a 19th century farmhouse. The 1828 Quaker Meeting House next to the museum was the offices of the Historical Society until 2016. It was originally on Weaver Street, but it was moved and restored by the Society in the 1970s. The White Plains Post Road and the Mamaroneck Road were the 2 main roads in pre-revolutionary Scarsdale. Most of the early houses were built along these roads. In 1774, 2 of the primary landowning families were the Cornells and the Griffins. The Secors and the Barkers also owned farms along Mamaroneck Road. The Cornell House is one of several historical homes still standing on the Mamaroneck Road and is now part of the Westchester Reformed Temple. Richard Cornell was one of the first Quakers to live in Scarsdale. Richard, his wife Hannah, and their 10 children moved to Scarsdale in 1727. He was the grandson of Thomas Cornell, who was granted land in the 1600s when New York was governed by the Dutch. During the Indian Wars, his compound in Mount Vernon was burned to the ground. His friend Anne Hutchison and her family were massacred, but Thomas Cornell escaped. This famous old home on Amerenik Road is known as the Griffin Fish House. It has been beautifully added onto by the 19th century fish family, and it has been lovingly maintained by several 20th century owners. Jonathan Griffin started buying land here in 1729. He was a Quaker from a very large family. He had several brothers. Griffin Avenue, which is where several of his brothers built houses, is the last street just before the Amerenik town line. This part of the Griffin family were loyalists to the king. The house was used during the Revolution, prior to the Battle of White Plains, by General Howe as his headquarters. And sitting here on this wonderful knoll of a hill overlooking the post road so that they could keep their eye on the troop movement going to and from White Plains. Our first town meeting after the Revolution was held here at Jonathan's house. A small cemetery with the graves of the Cornells and Griffins still stands nearby. This section apparently is all Cornells. The Griffins seem to be over there. The Cornells, like the Griffins, were a huge family. And when I say that they had a lot of children, you wouldn't believe it. Let's say that there were 4 Cornell brothers who originally came here from Long Island in the 1720s and the 1730s. And they all had humongous families, 12, 13 children in all of their houses. So that this whole cemetery, of course, would be all those people. Now, in looking and knowing that they had slaves, I am thinking that all of these small stones that are all over this cemetery, even like here and here and here, were the slaves of these families. Because many of the families, including our Jonathan Griffin, who died in the 1760s, freed his slaves upon his death. So they would have stayed on as freed people and would be buried in a cemetery with the former master. Jonathan Griffin's grandson, Daniel Tompkins, supported legislation to end slavery. He was the governor of New York State from 1807 to 1817, and James Monroe's vice president until 1825. In 1817, legislation was passed that gradually ended slavery over a 10-year period. The plaque near the Scarsdale Public Library was erected to mark his birthplace. He was born in a house on Olmsted Road. Old Army Road winds high above Scarsdale Village. Washington's men had marched and retreated along these paths, and it still has many pre-revolutionary homes. The Hunt House was built prior to 1789 by Joshua Hunt. After the war, all his property was confiscated because his son Israel had joined the British Army as a guide. Behind the house was a small building of fieldstone about 9 by 12 that was used as slave quarters. It had a fireplace and a stone floor. Richard Morse, who was the second Chief Justice of New York State, bought the Hunt farm. He was a slave owner himself and was recorded to have had 10 slaves, though not all at once. Judge Morris's primary residence was on Crane Road, known as the Crawford Morris House. The original owner was Samuel Crawford, a miller who bought his farm from one of Caleb Heathcote's daughters. He was a patriot who fought in the Battle of White Plains and the first Scarsdalian to give his life during the Revolution. He was bayoneted in a skirmish with British soldiers after returning from a spying mission in New York City. Before his death, he had stood beside his neighbor, Michael Varian, to endorse the Declaration of Independence in White Plains on July 11, 1776. Just south of the wayside cottage along the post road is the lovely house named the Locusts. It is also known as the Popham House. Major Popham was a patriot during the Revolution. He was promoted to captain after he fought in the Battle of Long Island and had captured a British officer and 18 other soldiers. Popham eloped with Judge Morris's daughter Mary, but the family soon reconciled. When Morris died, he left his extensive properties to his son-in-law. This lovely print from a painting by William Trost Richards depicts the Popham barnyard. Note the white Popham house in the background and the tall locust trees behind the house. The novelist James Fenimore Cooper would immortalize the locusts in his novel The Spy, A Tale of Neutral Ground. Being a frequent guest of the Pophams, he uses their house as the scene of the spying. He uses the corner fireplace hearth of the Underhill house in another scene. James Fenimore Cooper married Susan Delancey, great-granddaughter of Caleb Heathcote, in 1811, and they were married in the original Heathcote homestead in Mamaroneck. Cooper wrote his first two novels in a cottage on the Angevine farm near where the Scarsdale Middle School stands today on Mamaroneck Road. The Angevine house survived till 1878, when it was sold to Dr. Alexander Bruin, a friend of Cooper's, who built a mansion on the site that was later torn down. After Cooper left Scarsdale, he wrote over 32 novels. His best-known works included The Last of the Mohegans and The Leatherstocking Tales. The construction of the railroad in the mid-19th century would encourage a small group of entrepreneurs to build stately mansions here. The Powder Mill House is a magnificent example of this. The walls of this mansion are 18 inches thick, and a balcony surrounds the second floor. It has been restored with great care by the current owners. It was also the Greenacres Tea House that boasted a sunken garden and Italian fountains. An old sign near the door shows some of its previous residents. Ernest Hobol bought the land for this beautiful mansion in 1847. He owned extensive acres in the neighborhood and built what no longer exists, a powder mill that was powered by the Bronx River nearby. He manufactured gunpowder for the United States Army in the Mexican War in 1846 and dynamite for the building of the New York and Harlem railroads. Powder mill had at least 3 fatalities from explosions and fires before it was shut down. The Lego brothers, who made lithographic materials, bought the plant in 1870. It's exactly 50 years since the time that I bought the Underhill house in Scarsdale, and in those 50 years I have written many articles for the Scarsdale Historical Society, always written through the eyes of the person who was living in the house at the time. I wanted to do an article about 1876 because in my research I discovered that there were many very interesting things that were happening in Scarsdale, Westchester County, and actually in the Northeast at that time. So I did write the article, and I wrote it through the eyes of Barney Hennefield, a farmer who was living in the house at that time that year.
I'm now living in the old Underhill farmhouse with my wife Nova and our 4 children. Also living here are August and Annie Slingwater and John Galloway. I work the farm with John. August is a quarry master for the Bates family. They own a busy marble quarry over in Eastchester. Scarsdale is still a peaceful village and one of the smallest in Westchester. Only 529 people live here. Scarsdale still doesn't have any stores, but I can go right up the post road to White Plains and find any kind of store. Many of us are foreign-born, and there are so many Germans in this area that we have a huge German parade in White Plains every year. However, the population is really changing. A whole new group of wealthy businessmen have been buying up farms and building huge mansions. One of the first important men to build his country home here was our neighbor Charles Butler. Mr. Butler keeps adding to his land whenever anyone is willing to sell. His nephew Benjamin was living right across the road at the Wayside Cottage and thought the climate would be good for Charles's son Ogden, who is in poor health. Before his death, Ogden devoted himself to building orchards, greenhouses, and gardens. Frederick Law Olmsted is Mr. Butler's landscape architect. He built Central Park and Prospect Park in Brooklyn, but I have no need to visit those places. Mr. Butler recently put in lawn tennis courts for the new game that the rich are all playing. His daughters Emily and Anne love to go sea bathing in New Rochelle, but not an inch of skin from throat to wrists to ankles are allowed to show. My boys swim all summer in one of the holes at the Bronx River. They don't wear suits, of course. Mr. Butler is hardly the only one in town who has built a mansion. Colonel Alexander Crane has bought the Carmer estate and is beginning to buy as much land as he can. He is a wealthy lawyer and a brave man. He fought in the Civil War and spent 9 weeks in a Confederate prison. He really built up that mansion using stones from his quarry. It has 21 rooms. The Rowsley Mansion was built by William Bailey Lang. He bought up 35 acres from the Drakes over in back of us. He made his fortune as an iron merchant. His daughter, Maria Wheeler, lives in Castle Cozy. She has a son and 7 daughters. We all belong to St. James the Less Church. The Butlers, Hyatts, and Cranes are Presbyterians too. Now I'd like to talk to you about farmers. There are still plenty of us who work our land. My farm is 127 acres. I raise 6 varieties of grapes, 10 of apples, 2 of cherries, and 6 of pears. I have corn, rye, potatoes, and oats. Tomorrow I'll plant my most profitable crop, my pickle crop. We have our choice of pickle factories around here. This month I smoked 175 pounds of pork and beef. Hay is our most important crop. New York State supplies 1/5 of our country's hay needs since the Civil War. We feed it to our livestock, but the rich also buy it for their fancy thoroughbred horses. We sell it to Lewis Morris, who owns a horse farm. I have to tell you that we've had a terrible problem with packs of wild dogs that are killing our flocks of sheep. We've had some bad fires last year, and the beautiful Carpenter house on the Mamaroneck Road burned to the ground. We hear they may sell to a developer. Lewis Morris started that trend when he's bought up the Cornell farms on the Mamaroneck Road and cut them up into 10 and 50-acre parcels for sale. I just can't imagine what this town is coming to.
By the end of the 19th century, housing developments foreshadowing the suburbanization of Scarsdale were well underway. In 1890, the Authors Suburban Home Company began housing development on small lots. The deeds forbid factories, slaughterhouses, or other noxious, dangerous, or offensive business or trade. Between 1890 and 1915, the population in Scarsdale dramatically increased from 633 to over 2,000. The number of farms had declined from 35 to 12. James Cannon headed the influential Scarsdale Estate Company and formed the Heathcote Association. It was started by 9 friends, wealthy businessmen, lawyers, and bankers who wanted to build country estates to escape the crowds and urban poverty of the city. They bought the 127-acre Underhill Farm in 1900. Swampland was drained and the beloved duck pond along Heathcote Road was formed. The houses and barns had to be set back at least 150 feet, and they had sweeping front lawns on plots of 2 to 17 acres. Fortunately, the Heathcote Association decided to leave the Underhill farmhouse intact. Though later houses in other parts of Scarsdale were not as large, freestanding homes on landscaped lawns would become common. It is truly remarkable that so many of the early houses have endured the rapid growth and changes in Scarsdale. The legacy of Scarsdale is reflected in its old houses, reminding us how knowledge of the past is the key to understanding our present and future. New and old stories continue to be told.